Good afternoon to everyone joining the call, and welcome to Hub's Demystifying Insurance webinar hosted by Charity Village. With today's world in constant flux, it's really important that nonprofit organizations understand the risk to their business and are adequately prepared for and covered against events that could threaten their organization. We hope that today's session will provide you with further insight into some of the key coverages that can help protect your nonprofit operations. As Marina said, my name is Stephanie Dudley, and I'm the Vice President of Small Business Strategy here at Hub. I'm really happy to be here today, along with two of Hub's nonprofit specialists. Just a little bit about myself. I've been in the insurance industry for the past 23 years. I've worked on both the insurance company side as well as on the broker side. And I've held quite a variety of roles over the year, but I really do have a sincere passion for the nonprofit sector and have spent the majority of my career building programs to support groups and associations. Personally, I like to do a lot of volunteer work through the United Church, really supporting the implementation of programs to help combat food insecurity, such as community refrigerators, etc. During today's session, we're going to be starting off, and I'll provide you with a quick overview and introduction of Hub. Following that, I'm going to introduce you to Hub's nonprofit specialists, who will be providing an overview of three key insurance coverage that are really applicable to nonprofit organizations. As Marina mentioned, we'll be closing out the session with an open Q&A. So if you do have a question at any point during the session, please use that chat functionality to send it our way. And if we're unable to address it today due to timing, a Hub representative will be sure to follow up with you after the session. So just a little bit about Hub and why we're here today presenting along with Charity Village. You can see the numbers on the screen, and I won't go through them all, but although we're large in size, Hub is a small Canadian-born brokerage, and at our core, we're really the same company that we were 20 years ago, and that's a team of passionate experts who go above and beyond for their partners and customers, with proven expertise creating and delivering insurance solutions for organizations, groups and associations, as well as individuals. When it comes to nonprofits specifically, we do have experience across many industry segments within that space. Some of our target areas include healthcare, religious organizations, human service providers, foundations, charities, as well as education. As I did mention earlier, we specialize in solutions for groups and associations, and a few of our key partners include the Ontario Nonprofit Network, as well as the United Church of Canada. In Canada, and you can see the numbers on the screen, we serve about 5,000 clients that are really specific to the nonprofit sector, and we have a deep comprehension of that segment and really strong carrier relationships, so feel that allows us to deliver unrivaled risk and insurance advice as well as solutions to our customers and our partners. Nonprofit organizations, as I'm sure all of you know, do face a growing list of risks that really have a lot of potential to create significant disruption to your operations, harm to your brand and reputation, as well as financial loss. There are, however, a few really key and essential coverages that are very important to the nonprofit sector, and that's what we're going to take some time to highlight for you today. And those coverages include commercial general liability, directors and officers liability, which is often referred to as management liability, and finally cyber risk. So I'm very pleased to introduce two of my colleagues and two of Hub's nonprofit specialists. Joining us today, we have Steve Premiani. Steve joined Hub in 2014 as part of the commercial business unit. He began his insurance career in 1996 and has since acquired extensive experience in business development, account management, and program negotiation. During a career that expands nearly 3 decades, Steve has really established his reputation in the industry for building and maintaining strong relationships with both customers, organizations, as well as the insurance companies that respect the interests and goals of each party. In his current capacity as an account executive, Steve is responsible for a large number of nonprofit accounts where he works really closely with organizations on the development, marketing, and implementation of tailored insurance solutions. Steve is personally active in the nonprofit community and works locally volunteering with the Inn of the Good Shepherd. And also joining us, we have Jeremy Reese. And Jeremy joined Hub in 2015, started his insurance career back in 2004. He's worked on a large number of accounts in the nonprofit sector and continues to work on and serve a large number of clients within that space. Since joining Hub, Jeremy's been involved in the marketing renewal of many nonprofit as well as charitable organizations that each have a wide range of unique coverage needs. He has an excellent professional network to service and facilitate great insurance solutions. And Jeremy's very personally connected to the nonprofit segment and has extensive volunteer experience with the Distress Center of Greater Toronto. So welcome to Jeremy and Steve. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Steve, who's going to dive into the commercial general liability. And over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Steph. Thanks for that awesome overview and wonderful introduction. And thanks everyone for being here today so we can share some important insights with you as it really pertains to some pretty important subject matters for your sector. So one of the questions I get asked the most is, what insurance coverages do not-for-profits need? And when I talk about general liability, most people kind of ask what it is, what sort of protection does it provide, and whether or not they actually need it. So there's a ton to unpack here, and I think before kind of being able to just simply answer yes or no, it's kind of important to have a sort of high-level discussion about what the policy is, what kind of protection it provides, some of the risks that are associated with running a not-for-profit, and what type of protection the general liability policy can provide for your organization. So one of the most common liability policies that's purchased by nonprofits is the commercial general liability policy, or as it's commonly referred to, CGL policy. Overall, general liability insurance would protect your organization from accusations that a third party suffered some sort of bodily injury, property damage, or personal injury that really stems from your location, operations, and/or products. So it's really a coverage that protects the organization from third parties who are alleging some type of negligent conduct by the nonprofit, its employees or volunteers. And when you think about legal liability, negligence always really needs to be attached. So negligence is failing to do what a ordinarily prudent person would do under a set of circumstances, or doing something that an ordinarily prudent person wouldn't do under this certain set of circumstances. Another way to think of negligence is that the nonprofit failed to sort of use the proper standard of care in providing services. And then that failure led to some sort of harm, injury, or death at the damage of the third party's, at the heart of the third party's lawsuit. So generally speaking, next slide there, please. Yeah, so generally speaking, you'll find several different types of coverages that are included within a general liability package. Things such as molestation liability, non-owned auto liability, tenants legal liability are all part of a standard general liability policy. And those are just sort of name a few coverages. And we're going to sort of take a bit of a deeper dive into what some of those coverages actually mean as we get into the presentation a little bit further. But the CGL automatically covers directors, officers, and employees while acting within the scope of their duties. But it's equally important to sort of always make sure that coverage is extended to all the volunteers that are working with the organization. Not all policies that are issued by insurance companies are going to come with that extension. So it's really important to kind of make sure that you speak to your broker and that they understand your sector so that they sort of know what to ask for when you're looking for the right type of solution for your organization. But generally speaking, CGL policies will always cover a few different main areas. The first being bodily injury. So bodily injury is physical injury, sickness, disease, or death to a third party. So important to remember that these allegations always will be coming or need to be coming from a third party to trigger any type of liability allegation. And a major reason for this type of claim could be injuries that might be sustained at your organization's location, or offsite during, say, some type of fundraising or other program type of activities. But probably the most common claim that's filed underneath a nonprofit CGL policy would be, like a standard slip and fall claim filed by maybe a participant, a visitor, or a guest who might be attending, again, one of your fundraisers, or just your premises in general. And just to kind of maybe, wanted to highlight a few possible scenarios to give you kind of a bit of a clearer understanding. Like, let's say, an elderly guest at a social gathering badly broke an arm in a fall, because of, say, a poorly placed extension cord. Or let's say, a neighborhood association is holding a party to celebrate a park opening, and they've rented tables and chairs to, listen to a guest speaker. And say somebody towards the back stood on chairs for a better view, and then one of those chairs collapsed. It could set off sort of a domino effect of people falling over, that could result in several injuries. That could trigger the bodily injury section of the policy. Or even if a not-for-profit, say at a fundraiser, food was being served and it was alleged that it made a number of different people sick, and one of those individuals became so sick that they decided to initiate a lawsuit for their illness. That could also be a scenario where it triggers the bodily injury section of a general liability policy. So those are just sort of a few possible and common scenarios that can and actually that we've seen happen in the past. Then there's a second coverage section in a CGL policy, which is the property damage component. And that's property damage caused by your negligence that you would be legally liable for. So property damage is damage to tangible property of a third party. So important to kind of remember, it's not property that the organization itself owns or rents. It's specifically property belonging to a third party. So just as an example, for the property damage section, like let's say your nonprofit rent space for your office activities, and a volunteer or staff member accidentally starts a fire that spreads beyond your unit to a neighboring convenience store, or let's say bank, or whoever's next to you in whichever space you're renting or leasing, and then they decide to sue the organization for starting the fire. If your not-for-profit has a CGL policy, it would likely respond to cover the third-party property damages up to whatever limits you have in the policy, of course. And then the third section in a CGL policy is the personal injury section. And personal injury is really covered for any other type of injuries that might not fall underneath the bodily injury section. So it's a bit of an all perils kind of definition, where you're covered for almost everything except what the policy kind of excludes. Every policy is always going to be governed by a defined set of exclusions, definitions, and general conditions. But some examples of personal injury that a third party could possibly allege would be libel, which is a written statement about someone that's a personal attack to that individual. Slander, which is more spoken word. Wrongful entry, and violation of privacy. Defamation of character, which is the libel or slander component, is probably the biggest trigger for these types of claims that we see. Then there's the fourth coverage section, which is tenants' legal liability. And so, in Ontario, there's really probably only about 5% of small to mid-sized not-for-profits who actually own their own building, who own their own property. So for the other 95% that rent or lease, this coverage becomes really important. So it provides coverage when the organization is legally liable for damages to a leased property, right? So if, for example, the landlord decides to sue your organization for some type of damages to the building, which could have been started by an employee or volunteer, like let's say leaving the water on in the building accidentally, then this coverage section would respond, right? So it's kind of like a property damage trigger. Then there is the fifth coverage section, which is the non-owned automobile coverage section, and it's an extension again of the CGL policy that provides protection to the organization against claims that come up from employees or volunteers who use their own personal vehicles in the course of carrying out the organization's activities. So it could be delivering meals, it could be taking a client to an appointment, it could be picking up printing or dropping checks off at a bank, whatever the situation is. If an employee or volunteer is involved in an accident while using their vehicle at the direction of the organization, the not-for-profit could be sued for potential damages, right? So important kind of distinction, though, and an important thing to note is that the employee or volunteer is always going to look to their own personal automobile insurance for primary insurance, and then the not-for-profit non-owned auto section could be triggered in the event that there's additional charges that are filed against the organization because some crafty lawyer finds out that this individual was using his or her vehicle at the direction of the organization. So those are typically the five sort of standard coverages that you'd see in just about any sort of general liability wording. There is some subtle differences in the language and even some of the sublimits that kind of vary from company to company. But the main thing to ensure is that the product that you purchase is really designed and tailored for the not-for-profit world, and that's where your broker will or should sort of step in and let you know exactly what's needed. Next slide, please. So in addition to those five coverages, there's also some other extensions that could be purchased from insurance companies that would fall underneath the general liability policy. And these are quite common things that not-for-profits might need to consider. An example could be abuse liability, so allegations of abuse. Abuse liability can be purchased if your organization is working with vulnerable populations such as children, the elderly or disabled, who might allege some type of sexual, mental, or any other type of abuse. And most CGL policies, in fact, pretty much all CGL policies, are always going to contain an abuse exclusion. So the coverage needs to, after it's underwritten, needs to be brought back in by way of an endorsement or a completely separate abuse policy, depending on which insurance company you're working with. There really is only a small number of insurance companies in Canada that have the capacity to be able to offer the coverage. It's usually a pretty expensive coverage because of the risks that are associated with the allegations. But at the end of the day, it definitely could end up saving the organization a lot more than the premium if one of these allegations ever were to come up. They're usually pretty costly type allegations. Abuse policies will provide defense not just to the organization in the event that there is an allegation, but also to the alleged perpetrator. up into the point at which the allegations are substantiated. And then at that point, the defense would stop for the perpetrator, but continue for the organization. And the few insurance companies that do offer the coverage will most likely want to know specific pieces of information surrounding, what types of risk management strategies your nonprofit has in place to kind of mitigate those types of situations. So, they might request things like the protocols and abuse policies, and what sort of procedures do you have in place? Is screening done, and are police checks required for all volunteers and employees? And also, are they reviewed annually? So there's a whole laundry list of items that they're going to want to kind of know before even considering that coverage. Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those coverages where it's really unfortunate that the product really needs to exist, but the reality really is that physical, emotional, sexual abuse kind of happens, and organizations could face some pretty costly allegations, and that's regardless of the validity, right? I mean, there doesn't need to be any merit to the allegation. It could be completely meritless, but the policy would still step in and provide defense costs, and then judgments for any awardments that might be made. So, another thing to kind of consider when looking at a CGL policy, especially nowadays with things kind of changing and reopening, is special events insurance. And this could either be taken care of by way of your current CGL policy, or perhaps a standalone special events policy. So, it's important to kind of look at your CGL policy and determine whether or not that policy alone is adequate enough protection. A lot of CGL policies will exclude the larger scale events like fairs, festivals, fundraisers, and larger concerts. Insurance companies, they sort of know that those types of events come with a high risk exposure, but they also know that those types of events are incredibly paramount and important for not-for-profits to raise funds. So it's certainly important to make sure that you have productive dialogue with your broker, just to explain exactly what might be planned throughout the year, what might be anticipated throughout the year. And if new special events kind of pop up throughout the year, just important to kind of call your broker and make sure that they're aware and that they arrange the right insurance coverage on your behalf. And again, I mean, this is particularly important in the wake of things reopening and in-person events starting up again. Event insurance is usually purchased to cover the large type of events in case of an accident, and can include things like liquor liability, venue insurance, hall rental insurance. And the policies honestly are usually pretty easy to obtain, and they come with a super low cost. But to be able to have that peace of mind so you can kind of focus on other important stuff on the event planning list is important. So yeah, I mean, the reality is that all sorts of different types of liability claims against nonprofits can and do happen, and probably a lot more often than you might think. And we've seen some incredibly high payouts, and then of course the claims can also come with additional kind of risk to the nonprofit's operational reputation. So that's a huge other thing to consider. So yeah, really important to kind of just make sure that you have the proper risk analysis done through your broker, so that they can find out what makes the most sense for your organization. And the two things that I kind of always suggest that you ask yourself, and two things that I always advise any nonprofit that I'm speaking with to ask themselves are, could the actions of the organization hurt or injure anybody, which would be the bodily injury component. And then secondly, could the actions of the organization damage anything, which would be the property damage component. And if the answer to either one of those questions is yes, or if your organization provides a service, a product, holds events or fundraisers then you definitely need to consider having a CGL policy just to avoid kind of potential crippling financial damages. But yeah, so that's a ton of information at once, but certainly happy to address any questions at the end of our presentation, or any other time as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. A really good overview of the CGL coverage there. And I think some of those examples really help to highlight where and when the various components of the coverage would apply. So appreciate that.
Thank you.
And with that, I am going to now ask Jeremy to take over here. And I know he is going to dive into directors and officers liability, followed by cyber risk. So thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Steph. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us and attending this webinar. I think it's really important to our team, and I hope you find some value in it. Thank you to Marina as well for welcoming us, and Steve for the wonderful overview of the general liability and the summary of the individual coverages that are accounted for in that type of coverage in general liability. Okay, so here we are, we're talking about directors and officers liability. It's usually one of the coverages that nonprofit and charitable organizations start with. Newer organizations, it's really the basis in some ways for gathering and getting great volunteers and directors and officers, as the name says. I'll go through this relatively quickly with regards to the definition, and then kind of break it out into little components so you have a sense of some of the complexity of it. So directors and officers insurance is also known as management liability. It covers your organization's leadership against claims of negligence, as Steve mentioned, with general liability as well. But this is regarding oversight versus third-party exposures and decisions that could negatively affect your organization's financial performance. So why is this important? Because lawsuits are particularly onerous and they can be really expensive when they're targeted against board members' personal assets. It's damaging to the organization and damaging to the individual. So and organizations thrive on people. Those are their greatest assets. And I submit to you that the best way to attract really good people is to protect them. So why would you want to get directors and officers insurance or insurance in general? The basis of this idea is it provides peace of mind. It in doing so, you'll attract and help retain better volunteers, better staff, better board members, and it allows your stakeholders to feel like you've done a good job of providing the oversight. So in a way, the first step of oversight is actually getting insurance and at least planning for it and making sure you have all the resources and the information required to obtain that insurance. So why do I need it? Well, there's there are some rules and regulations regarding working at a nonprofit and volunteering and being on a board. And being on a board, the directors and officers have a duty to exercise due diligence and care in overseeing the management of the organization they serve. They're required to act in good faith in the best interest of their organizations. So, this is something that is really important to furthering the organization's goals and mandates, and in a way protecting the future of your organization. There's often opportunities to protect your organization in advance. So when we deal with new organizations, we like to discuss their operations, where they see themselves going. Newer organizations don't always have the financial history and the insurance history that more established organizations do. So if we could go into maybe a little bit more depth into what it takes to qualify for directors and officers insurance, it usually takes some financials. To seek the insurance, you need a completed application, and the application will speak to your financials as well as your budget and your operations. Do you have any programming? Do you, are you planning on working overseas, or is your the territory your operations are restricted to. Is it inside of Canada or even Ontario or a specific province or area? Do you have a volunteer exposure? Are you planning on doing events as well? Not that this is event insurance, but it might be applicable to your operations. Some of the things, a lot of the people that contact me for directors and officers insurance ask about the things that affect cost, because this is an insurance policy that's not necessarily represented by a tangible thing like a house or a rented space, but it is in a way insured based on things like revenue, your claims history, how much insurance you're required to have. Sometimes you'll have a contractual agreement with your board members, with other partner organizations, that you carry a certain level of insurance. So like if you're having a $5 or $10 million policy, it's of course going to be more than a $2 million policy. Your organization's finances are taken into account. What's the financial health of your organization? So, everyone's a nonprofit. So obviously you're not going to have a great deal of profit, but do your books balance at the end of the year, or is there a little bit of a deficit or some debt that you're carrying that might be problematic in qualifying for insurance, or maybe qualifying for the best rate of insurance? Another factor is your claims history. Have you had any recent claims? So some great examples of claims are employee allegations of harassment, wrongful termination, and bankruptcy. The most typical one we're seeing, particularly over the last few years, has been wrongful dismissals. I think with the global staffing shortages and turnover of employees, there's bound to be some wrongful dismissals. And there are some excellent coverages in directors and officers insurance that relate to that. I'll speak to that in the next slide. Can I please have the next slide? Thank you so much. So directors and officers liability, has some typical coverages. We could go into a great deal more depth, but I'll keep this as simple and high level as possible so that you see what areas are triggered by what coverages and claims. And we'll keep it really to what's on the page. So side A is a typical coverage that relates to defense costs and settlements. And it also asserts itself for the individual directors and officers as well as the organization as a whole. It's probably the most common area to see active in a claim, as is side B. In fact, I would say most policy, a lot of insurance companies carry side A and side B, and some may not carry side C. It depends, or your side C may not be applicable to your organization. It depends if you have security exposure or fiduciary exposure that's related to security specifically, and not all nonprofits or charities do. Side B itself reimburses organizations for the expenses while defending in accordance to the obligations and the policy conditions. Those are important to consider when you read your policy. A common area I see issues in are when there's say a wrongful dismissal case, just to use that as an example. The insurance companies like to have a hand in deciding the legal defense, and a lot of organizations like to hire their own legal team. So it's better to have a call and speak to the claims adjuster and see if there's some middle ground that can be had. Sometimes they can agree upon using a similar person or a known person to both parties. That way you can make sure that you have coverage for that expense. And it's always good to be in front of that. And then you can be working cohesively together with the claims adjusters as well, and make sure that you're getting the most effect for your dollar. If we could have the next slide, please. So we're going to go into cyber insurance, or cyber risk as it's called. It's important. It's a very topical topic in insurance right now. We seem to be seeing a lot more global exposure to cyber risk and cyber loss. Seems every other day in the newspaper, you seem to be hearing about a new company that's been hacked, or or some organization that's had their information breached. Cyber insurance is really coming to its own. I would say it became a lot more aware. People became a lot more aware of it after the federal government implemented a cyber breach notification law in the fall, I believe, of 2018, where organizations are mandated to let everyone know about the breaches they have, and it can't be transferred over to a third party. So that's if you've hired someone to act on your behalf to manage your IT affairs, or your donation website, which is a very popular thing for nonprofits. The onus still comes back to you. So it's really important that you indemnify, or you utilize a cyber insurance policy that's robust and has coverage for things like crime losses, to really better mitigate this type of risk. What is cyber insurance? Cyber liability insurance market continues to evolve at a very fast pace, as we know. This coverage provides crisis management following a data breach. It may cover, for example, the expense of forensic investigation. This also can include forensic accounting, which is a common thing, privacy attorney, notification to affected individuals. That can be really, actually, probably the most costly factor of cyber insurance. Credit monitoring, public relations costs or public relations teams, extortion payments, data restoration, which can be really problematic and a very time-sensitive problem. There are a lot of aspects to this that are incredibly important. We could talk probably all day about the different elements of cost and services that are required to get an organization back up to speed in the event that their system is locked down or corrupt to the point where not corrupt, but non-working to the point it's because of a cyber breach, that they have to rebuild things, and that can be very timely and costly. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's really important to get ahead of this type of risk and have cyber insurance. A lot of the cyber companies also provide really excellent tools. They'll have apps that you can report claims on. They'll send you updates on those apps with the latest articles, the latest things to look out for in the event that there are some things to look like, different types of phishing attacks, things you can do to better mitigate your risk. A common one is multi-factor authentication. That's a very important one that I think a lot of organizations are embracing. You could look at, what are you doing to reduce your digital footprint, reduce the signs of, make sure that the people that are visiting your donations page, that the site's fully encrypted and that their information is secure. Common examples of claims in this area of the insurance industry and the nonprofit industry are ransomware. Another one is social engineering and business interruption. And business interruption really encompasses all of the interruptions that could be caused in the event that your system is breached. Could I have the next slide, please? So what can you do as an organization to protect against a breach or a cyber claim? These are really important. I think there's a lot of information in the public about these, but it's good to go over them again and discuss. So review your systems on an annual basis. Really have your team, maybe even more often than that, have your team really look at the operations that are specific to your organization security, and create procedures and protocols, document them. I think that's important because you may be asked for that at a later date. Enable disk encryption, encrypting your, all the devices and laptops that your company uses. A lot of policies also cover people using personal devices, but it's important to make sure that that is the case. With some smaller policies might have wording around that might be specific and you may want to take a look at. Make sure that your organizations have procedures to back up, archive, and restore sensitive data, particularly if it's critical to your operations and your systems, so that you can, get back up and running as fast as possible. What are your policies around removing content? This is one we get asked a lot. I think this is a new question that we've been asked a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. What are your policies around removing content, third-party content that's libelous or infringing or otherwise controversial? I think it's important that you do have a policy around that, and most insurance companies that provide a really robust cyber policy now require that. Learn more about your organization's digital footprint. Going back to that, what are your vulnerabilities online? You can sometimes even hire a consultant. Some of the insurance companies are even offering a loss assessment report that speaks to this specific area. And the best way to do all these things, I really think, is to speak to an insurance broker, get them to provide you with some quotes, and maybe they can give you some of this information, as well as provide you with cyber insurance. I think if you can get a comprehensive cyber policy that includes crime coverage, you'll be well protected and probably ahead of the curve. Many organizations don't carry cyber insurance, and I think this is an area that's really it merits more concern and greater attention. And I know our team would be happy to talk to you about that, and anything we can do to just give you some information and educate you, much like this webinar, I think is a valuable opportunity to inform you and protect the nonprofit and charitable community as a whole. Yeah, and I think that's all I have on cyber risk. Thank you very much for your time.
That's really great, Jeremy. Thanks so much for taking the time to go through that. I know sometimes insurance coverages are not the most interesting and exciting topics for everyone, but really helped us to kind of understand and highlight why those coverages are so important to nonprofit organizations and how we might be able to provide solutions. So thanks both Jeremy and Steve, really appreciate your time today. And I think that we do have a few minutes left for Q&A, so I'm going to turn it back over to Marina to facilitate that for us.
Wonderful, thank you, Stephanie. And we've had so many wonderful questions come in. So what I'm going to ask in this, I'm going to surprise the Hub team a little bit here, so I hope this is okay. If we don't get to your question today in our limited time, please just type in the question box, please follow up with me, and that will be providing your permission for us to pass your question and your email address along to the Hub team to follow back up with you afterwards, okay? We're also going to get some contact information up on the screen as well, so that if your question isn't answered, you can reach out to them directly. So I'd like to start with a question that we had that came in about the D&O insurance, and many people were asking this question about who it actually covers. So, understanding that it covers elected board of directors, but what about staff and senior leadership and executive directors who are salaried? Does it cover them as well, or is there anything that people should know about with that?
Hi, I'm Marina. I'd be happy to answer that. So it's, generally it does, but I think what's really important, what would be really informative, is if you ask your broker or go to the wording of the actual policy and look up who is the insured, or who is insured. What is the insured person's definition? So there's a definition in most policies of who is an insured, and the insured generally includes all those people, but it's important to know because there may be some exclusions or specifics to a specific carrier's policies and wordings that may increase that definition and widen the scope or decrease it. So generally, yes, generally board members, employees, volunteers, and I think even their family sometimes, and people acting on behalf of the board in all types of insurance. I think it's important that you know who is an insured for your general liability, for your for any exposure in liability exposure there is regarding service, oversight, in cyber, you should know who isn't contained in that definition, and it'll be specific to your policy. But generally, yes, I would say those people are covered, but find out for sure.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And Jeremy, while we've got you here, let's just talk a little bit about some of the cyber security questions that are coming in. So, you know, often hear about larger organizations. You know, usually it's kind of big companies that we hear about that are suffering these attacks. Is it, you know, really necessary? Like, are smaller nonprofits really vulnerable to these types of cyber attacks?
That's a great question. You know, the fun and entertaining things always make the news, and everybody, you know, doesn't really want to hear about the little guy. But the reality is, in cyber insurance, the smaller organizations, even the medium-sized organizations, really are a better target because they're more vulnerable. So cyber crimes tend to actually, the majority of them, if you go on an occurrence basis versus a size and complexity, happen to the small organizations and the medium-sized organizations because they're more vulnerable. You know, they're the low-hanging fruit. They're lacking the basic security sometimes that the larger organizations can afford. They don't necessarily have the resources or education because they've got, you know, less staff, so they don't have like a dedicated necessarily IT team. Some do, some don't. But and maybe they don't have the budget for cyber insurance or something of that sort to enable them as much as they could if they had more resources. And I think this is a critical area that needs to be really considered, not only by you know, individual organizations, but governing bodies and bodies that provide funding for organizations. I think this type of exposure is one that merits assistance and consideration. You know, and I think always the vulnerable should be protected, and in this case, the small organizations are definitely vulnerable in this area. Hope that helps.
Thanks, Jeremy. We actually just had one of our participants, unfortunately, indicate that they themselves, that their nonprofit, were targeted. So, you know, that's
sorry to hear about that.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that's a real challenge. Okay, we have a lot of organizations that are using third-party vendors, things like PayPal and other, you know, data collecting software or other programs. How does that relate to their exposure to cyber attacks? Does that impact what type of insurance coverage they should be looking at?
Sure. Yeah. No, it definitely, going back to what I was speaking about. So in 2018, the government actually mandated the cyber breach notification. So you really can't count on your third-party vendor to protect you in the event of a claim, because you would still be held liable as an organization. This is part of the Personal Information Protection and Electronics Act. It's mandatory, and record-keeping provisions in this area require that you notify all the parties involved, and it can be really expensive. So again, it's another reason that I would encourage people to consider cyber insurance. That being said, you know, if you're going to work with a third party as well, do they have cyber insurance? Because you want to be able to recoup your losses, and your cyber insurance company for your entity will want to be able to recoup your losses as well from another third party. And so let's say that your organization was hacked somehow, maybe their financial services were hacked, and another organization's partner was the one doing that. You would want to make sure you work with people with insurance. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have a couple of questions for for Steve now.
Sure.
Steve, you mentioned about purchasing abuse coverage when working with vulnerable people. So could you talk a little bit more about what type of information is required to get that kind of coverage? Is there an application? What should organizations be expecting there?
Sure. Yep. Thanks for the question, Marina. Yeah, I mean, so you know, an organization is really subject to vicarious liability, right? That kind of stems from the actions of their employees and volunteers. And so it then becomes really important to make sure that there are specific protocols and procedures in place to really protect the organization and staff. So when insurance companies are looking at the different exposures, they're pretty much all going to want to kind of see very similar information, and that information is captured by way of an application usually. And it's also honestly a pretty good opportunity, I think, for organizations to kind of complete a thorough review of their existing policies and maybe even kind of consider opportunities to improve their current protocols. But they're usually going to want to see things like, like, does the organization have a formal written protocol policy in place? What forms the basis of that policy? Maybe have the protocols been reviewed by legal counsel? And, are the written applications, reference checks, are they all sort of done on all employed and volunteers? How maybe, how do organizations enforce and implement those protocols? So there's a whole list of questions that are usually asked. And it really, depending on the information that's provided, insurance companies will look at the information and then make a decision on sort of what they're able to offer in terms of limits to that particular organization. Like, for example, so if an organization had, full thorough protocols in place, established protocols, and they've got a very good, clean track record, and, they've had, no prior claims, insurance companies can offer some pretty high limits depending on what their capacity might be. If it's a smaller organization, for example, with, say, no prior abuse coverage and maybe some newly implemented protocols, then the organization might only want to offer, really incidental small limits, like, say, 250,000. And obviously, if there's no protocols in place, then the organization, or sorry, the insurance company might just decide that they're not willing or comfortable to offer the coverage at all. So, it really kind of depends on a few factors, right? Like, I mean, are there protocols in place surrounding abuse? Has the organization purchased abuse in the past? What's the nature of the risks that are involved? And then based on that, they'll kind of make a decision on whether or not they're able to offer the coverage. But I think kind of what it boils down to is really, in order for an organization to protect itself and qualify for the coverage, there should be some sort of written guidelines and protocols in place. And we're certainly able, if the organization doesn't have those in place currently, we're certainly able to provide some direction and guidance in that area to help get those in place and established.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Steve. Now, we haven't talked too much about COVID today. So when we, before we wrap up, I want to just cover, because we've had quite a few questions coming in about what should nonprofits know? Like, are there any sort of current things that are new since COVID or at this point in our COVID journey? Are there any things related to insurance, whether it's special events or remote workers or kind of anything like that related to the COVID experience right now that they should know about and be prepared to have covered with their insurance?
Sure, Marina, thank you. I'd be happy to speak to some of that, for sure. So it's an evolving situation. It has been evolving. I would say that continue to follow the regional, municipal, and provincial guidelines regarding COVID exposures and protocols with regards to, whether it be masking or social distancing or the type of operations you're setting up, event planning, which would be a really important thing. Some underwriters may ask about that. With regards to how it affects insurance, most people's insurance now includes exclusions regarding communicable diseases. So there is an exclusion on most insurance policies relating to COVID. What else would I say with respect to that? A really good thing to know is that the insurance companies have less appetite and capacity to handle certain types of events now because of the exposure and potential greater risk related to, say, being in a social environment where there's a lot of people. I think there's less of an appetite from insurance companies to do things like events. So a common thing that used to happen, I'm seeing more of now, which is fantastic because it's summertime and it's beautiful. I hope it's beautiful. Everyone is right now, and they can go out and enjoy some sort of fresh air. Hopefully it's sunny. It's difficult to get event insurance. Steve brought up some really wonderful points previously about event insurance, but there's less carriers willing to offer it. That being said, we can still get event insurance, but it's a little bit more expensive because of this reluctance and the added risk and potential claim that might be related to the risk due to COVID and just a reluctance on the insurance company side and an increasing cost for so many things. Everything's increased in cost since COVID and all types of insurance, but outside of insurance as well, building costs and construction costs and food, cartage costs, moving items from one place, logistical costs, those types of things are to be considered and mindful of. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. I mean, there's a lot more information out there, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Jeremy, sorry, I'll just jump in and add quickly. I mean, there's a host of different types of risks that not-for-profits face on a pretty regular basis. But yeah, COVID's definitely making it a little bit more challenging. And I think it's going to be important kind of going forward to make sure that some simple kind of guidelines and procedures are put in place, right? So so simple risk reduction measures are going to need to be sort of implemented going forward, right? And that could include anything like physical distancing measures, engineering controls, obviously PPP and sort of, and ensuring other protection is in place, and ensuring personal hygiene and all sorts of different safety measures are kind of implemented. Things that we, might have thought about in the past, but certainly maybe not to the same extent. I think is going to be important, and I think it's going to be information that insurance companies are all looking for to ensure that people and organizations are kind of implementing those measures to kind of reduce the risk to the extent that they possibly can. So, where we might not have seen that asked for in the past, we might see it being asked for from insurance companies on a sort of go forward basis as things kind of start to reopen and face-to-face in-person events start to happen again.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve and Jeremy. Really appreciate it. We had so many questions we couldn't get to today. So many wonderful questions coming in. I am conscious of time. So again, if you want someone from Hub to follow up, please just pop that in. Please follow up in the question box, and that will give us permission to share your email address and your question. Stephanie, do you have any final comments before we wrap today?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I know how busy everybody is, so we do appreciate you spending this hour with us. And Marina, and to Charity Village, special thank you to you for inviting Hub today and having us here hosting such a great event alongside of you. And to your point, if you do have a question or you would like somebody from Hub to follow up with you, please feel free to reach out to us. The information's on the screen, or Marina can help you out with that. Thanks so much, and hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Really appreciate the presentation today, and it's always a pleasure to work with the Hub team. Just wanted to remind all our participants that you will receive a follow-up email later today with a link to the webinar recording. Please feel free to share that link with your colleagues as well. It's all publicly available. The email will also include a survey link you can fill out with your feedback on today's webinar. There will be a space there as well if you want to provide information to get a follow-up from Hub. So that's another way you can do that. And of course, we'll be sure to share feedback with our presenters. I hope you'll join us for next week's free webinar. We're going to be talking a little bit more about cybersecurity concerns that your nonprofit or charity should be aware of. You can find more information on that and all of our upcoming webinars at charityvillage.com/webinars. Thank you again for taking part today. I wish all of you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.